There is a word in the English language that has become synonymous with a specific sexual act. A word so thoroughly associated with one particular meaning that most people have no idea it comes from a city. A city in a story. A story in a book that has been read, debated, weaponized, and mistranslated for over 2,000 years. The word is Sodom, and the act it supposedly names has been used to justify persecution, imprisonment, torture, and death for centuries. Entire legal codes were built on it. Lives were destroyed because of it. People were executed in its name. There is only one problem. The city of Sodom, in the biblical text, was not primarily condemned for a sexual sin. It was condemned for something else entirely. Something that is far less dramatic, far less titillating, and far more uncomfortable for modern societies to confront. Something that the text actually says, in plain language, that almost no one ever quotes. This is the Sodom file, and the sin they replaced with a different sin is the most important substitution in the history of Western moral thought. Let us begin where the story begins. Not with fire and brimstone, not with the infamous scene at Lot's door, but earlier, much earlier, with a negotiation. Genesis chapter 18. Before anything happens to Sodom, before the angels arrive, before the crowd gathers at Lot's door, there is a conversation between Abraham and God. God has decided to investigate the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The outcry against them, he says, is very great. He is going down to see whether they have done as bad as the outcry that has reached him. And Abraham, remarkably, pushes back. He begins to negotiate. And what he is negotiating for is not a stay of execution for the wicked. He is not asking God to spare the sinners. He is asking God to spare the city for the sake of the righteous, the tzaddikim, if any can be found within it. Suppose there are 50 righteous people in the city. Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Abraham pushes the number down. 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. Each time, God agrees. If 10 righteous people can be found in Sodom, the whole city will be spared. This is the first anomaly. Why is the focus entirely on the righteous remnant? Why is the entire fate of the city determined by the presence or absence of a specific group? If this were a straightforward story about sexual sin, why would the righteousness of 10 people be sufficient to save everyone? What kind of theology is this, and what is it actually about? The Hebrew word used here is tzaddikim, righteous ones. But this word carries enormous freight in the Hebrew tradition. It is not simply a generic word for good people. In later Jewish mystical thought, the tzaddikim are a specific category, the hidden righteous ones, whose merit sustains the world, the pillars on which reality rests. The idea that 10 such people could save an entire city is not a general moral principle. It is a very specific theological claim about how the world works. Why is this the frame for the Sodom story? Why does Abraham negotiate for righteous insiders rather than arguing for mercy towards sinners? The official answer is that Abraham is interceding on behalf of his nephew, Lot, who lives in Sodom. But the text doesn't say that. The text focuses entirely on the tzaddikim as a category. The personal relationship is background noise. The theological structure is the foreground. Something else is going on. And to understand what it is, we need to go to the word at the center of everything. Part 2. The clue. The word sod. 2:30 to 5. Here is where the linguistic forensics begin. And this is the part that almost no one who quotes the Sodom story ever mentions. The name Sodom in Hebrew is stom. Stom, spelled Samech Dalet Mem. And floating next to it, in the same Semitic language family, is a completely different word that has been entangled with the city's name for centuries of Western interpretation. The word is sod, spelled Samek Vav Daled. In English translation traditions, particularly in Latin and then in the languages derived from Latin, these two words got acoustically confused. The name of the city and this other word sound similar enough, in transliteration, that a false connection was established in the popular imagination and then hardened into assumed fact. But what does sod actually mean in the Hebrew Bible? Look at every instance of this word in the text, not in later commentaries, not in theological traditions, in the actual biblical text itself. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 13. One who conceals a matter has a sod, a secret counsel, a closed circle of trusted confidants. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 19. Do not associate with someone who opens his lips too wide and reveals a sod, a confidential assembly, a private deliberation. Psalm 25, verse 14. The sod of the Lord is with those who fear him, the secret counsel of God, the inner circle of divine deliberation. Amos chapter 3, verse 7. Surely the Lord God does nothing without revealing his sod to his servants the prophets, his inner counsel, his closed deliberation, the private knowledge shared only with the initiated. Sod, throughout the Hebrew Bible, means secret counsel. It means closed assembly. It means the inner circle of a deliberative body from which outsiders are excluded. It is a political and judicial term. It describes the kind of gathering that happens behind closed doors, where important decisions are made, where membership is exclusive and deliberate. Now, why does this matter for the Sodom story? Because the word that gave English its term for a sexual act is not the word for a sexual act. It is the word for a private, deliberative counsel. And the question that follows from that is, what was actually happening in Sodom that required the destruction of two major cities, the intervention of divine messengers, and the negotiation of the most elaborate theological conversation in the book of Genesis? The answer, hidden in plain sight, is that the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were powerful, wealthy, politically organized city-states. They had councils, they had deliberative bodies, they had exclusionary social structures, and they were doing something with that power and that wealth that drew the attention of heaven. The sexual reading of the story came later, much later, and it came for reasons that had everything to do with politics and nothing to do with careful attention to the text. Now we get to the most important piece of evidence, the piece that should, by any standard of honest reading, settle the question of what the sin of Sodom actually was. Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49. The prophet Ezekiel, writing in the 6th century BCE, addresses Jerusalem directly. He is condemning Jerusalem for its own sins, and he uses Sodom as the comparison point. Jerusalem, he says, has become worse than Sodom. And then, remarkably, with complete specificity, he tells us exactly what Sodom's sin was. This is the direct quote, word for word, from the text that most people who cite the Sodom story have never read. Ezekiel says, Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her, and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. Let us be very precise about what Ezekiel is saying. He is writing centuries after the Genesis story. He is a prophet deeply familiar with the tradition. He is using Sodom as the paradigmatic example of sin, as the baseline of wickedness against which to measure Jerusalem's corruption. And when he itemizes what Sodom's sin actually was, not a single item on his list is sexual. Pride, fullness of bread, meaning excess wealth, abundance beyond need. Abundance of idleness, the luxury of a society that has more than enough and does nothing useful with its surplus. And then the defining clause, she did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. This is an economic and social indictment. Sodom was wealthy. Sodom was comfortable. Sodom was proud. And Sodom systematically failed to redistribute its resources toward those who had none. The city had everything and gave nothing. The hand of the poor and needy reached out, and Sodom's hand did not meet it. Ezekiel continues in verse 50. And they were haughty, and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw good. The word translated as abomination here is to'eva, and this word is important. It is a ritual and cultural term, not primarily a sexual term. It appears in Leviticus in contexts involving dietary laws, economic cheating, idolatry, and various forms of ritual impurity. The abomination Ezekiel references follows from the social and economic failures he has just listed, not from anything sexual. Here is what is astonishing about Ezekiel's testimony. He was not a marginal figure. He was not an obscure heretic writing from outside the tradition. He was one of the major prophets of the Hebrew Bible, writing within the canonical tradition, using Sodom as a common cultural reference. His interpretation of what Sodom did was clearly the one his audience would have recognized, which means that for the original audience of these texts, the Sodom story was understood as being primarily about economic injustice and social arrogance. The sexual reading was not the original reading. It was a later addition, a substitution, and it was made for reasons. Now let us ask the historian's question. Who wrote the Sodom story? When? And what did they need it to accomplish?
The cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar,
were historical settlements in the region south of the Dead Sea. Archaeological evidence suggests the area was heavily populated in the early Bronze Age, around 3000 to 2000 BCE, with cities that were, by the standards of the time, wealthy and well-organized. The region appears to have undergone significant environmental disruption sometime around 2000 BCE, possibly related to seismic activity, sulfur deposits, or other geological events that later writers would interpret through a theological lens. The people who lived in these cities were Canaanites. The people who wrote about them were Israelites. And the relationship between those two groups is one of the defining tensions of the entire Hebrew Bible. The Canaanite city-states were, by many measures, more sophisticated than the Israelite tribal confederacy. They had urban centers. They had trade networks. They had writing systems. They had religious institutions. They had economic surplus. They were, in the language of the ancient Near East, successful. And they were the people whose land the Israelites believed God had promised them. The conquest narrative, the story of how Israel took possession of Canaan, required a theological justification. You cannot simply take people's land. You need a reason. You need the people whose land you are taking to deserve what is happening to them. This is where the Sodom story does its work. It establishes a template. These cities were wealthy. They were proud. They were organized around the exclusion of outsiders and the hoarding of resources. They were the kind of people who, when two strangers arrive at their gates, respond not with hospitality, but with hostility. They represent everything that the nomadic, herding, covenant-bound Israelite tradition positioned itself against. The social critique is real. Sodom's economic arrogance, its failure to share its abundance with the poor and needy, was a genuine indictment from a tradition that placed enormous theological weight on care for the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. The command to love the stranger because you were strangers in Egypt appears repeatedly in the Mosaic Law. It is one of the most frequently repeated ethical mandates in the Torah. A city that rejected and threatened strangers was, from this perspective, genuinely condemned by its own conduct. But the economic and social critique had a problem. It was complicated. It was structural. It required thinking about systems and institutions and distributions of wealth. It required recognizing that prosperity itself could be a form of sin if it was achieved at the expense of others and maintained by excluding those who had nothing. The sexual reading was simpler, more visceral, more immediately shocking. and more useful as a tool of cultural discreditation. If Sodom's sin was economic arrogance, then Sodom was a cautionary tale about the dangers of wealth without justice, a critique that applied uncomfortably to any prosperous society, including eventually Israel itself. If Sodom's sin was sexual, then Sodom was simply other, simply depraved, simply the kind of people who deserved what they got. Case closed. And in closing that case, something else was also closed. The deeper question, the harder question, the question that prophets from Ezekiel to Amos to Isaiah kept trying to reopen. What does a society owe to those who have nothing? Let me address the obvious objection. The scene at Lot's door. The crowd gathering and demanding to know, yada, the two visitors. This is the passage that has been used for centuries to establish the sexual reading of the story. How do we account for it? The Hebrew word at the center of this scene is yada, yada.
In the King James Version, it is translated as no, which English readers in the 17th century would have understood as a euphemism for sexual intercourse, consistent with its use in passages like Genesis 4, verse 1. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived. So the argument runs. The men of Sodom wanted to sexually assault the visiting angels. This is the sin. This is what God destroyed 2 cities for. 3 responses. First, yada appears 943 times in the Hebrew Bible. It carries a sexual meaning in approximately 15 of those instances, less than 2%. In the overwhelming majority of its appearances, it means to know in the cognitive sense, to perceive, to recognize, to understand, to investigate, to interrogate. The default meaning of yada is not sexual, it is epistemic. Second, consider the context. 2 strangers have arrived in Sodom. Sodom is a powerful city-state with, as Ezekiel tells us, a deeply exclusionary culture. Strangers are not welcome. The crowd gathers and demands that Lot bring the men out so that they can yada them. This is the language of interrogation, of security forces demanding to know who these people are, of a xenophobic culture confronting people who have entered without authorization. Bring them out so we can examine them, so we can establish who they are, so we can find out what they are doing here. This reading is entirely consistent with the social indictment Ezekiel provides. A culture that does not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy is also a culture that does not welcome the stranger. The hostility toward the visitors is the same sin as the hostility toward the poor, the refusal to extend care and protection to those outside the privileged circle. Third, the sexual reading of this scene was not the dominant interpretation in early Jewish tradition. The rabbis of the Talmud debated the sin of Sodom extensively. They focused on economic exploitation, on the city's elaborate systems for punishing charity toward outsiders, on the legal structure Sodom had developed to protect the wealthy from any obligation toward the poor. One famous rabbinic tradition describes a law in Sodom that made it illegal to give food or assistance to a stranger, a law enforced with punishment. The sexual reading was a later Christian theological development, particularly associated with a period when the church needed to establish detailed sexual ethics and found convenient scriptural support. But here is the strange part. Even if we accept the most aggressive sexual reading of the yada scene, even if we say the crowd intended assault, Ezekiel's testimony remains. He wrote after Genesis. He knew the Genesis account. He chose, in his comprehensive indictment of Sodom's wickedness, not to mention it. He focused on pride and surplus and the closed fist toward the poor. That choice, by one of the major prophets of the tradition, is telling. Let us be precise about what happened to this story. Because the substitution of sins, the replacement of the economic indictment with the sexual one, followed a pattern that we have seen in other investigations, a pattern with identifiable stages. Stage 1. The original text contains a complex structural critique: wealth without justice, abundance without generosity, the organized exclusion of the poor from the prosperity of the city. This is Ezekiel's Sodom,
This is the Sodom that the prophetic tradition understood and condemned. Stage 2. Within the same source material, there is a more vivid and visceral episode. The scene at the door, the crowd, the demand, the angels, Lot's bizarre and troubling offer of his daughters in place of the guests. This is dramatic material. It is the kind of scene that lodges in the memory. It is the kind of scene that readers return to. Stage 3. The vivid episode gradually displaces the structural critique, not through any single deliberate act of censorship, but through the accumulated weight of what gets quoted, what gets preached, what gets taught, what gets repeated. The scene at the door is memorable. The failure to strengthen the hand of the poor and needy is a sentence in a chapter of Ezekiel that most people have never read. Stage 4. The displaced reading enters legal and theological codification. Once the sexual interpretation became dominant in late antique and medieval Christian theology, it was encoded in canon law, in secular law, in the taxonomies of sin and punishment. The word sodomy entered legal language. People were executed under laws derived from this interpretation. The interpretation was no longer a reading, it was a fact. Stage 5. The original meaning is completely obscured, not just forgotten, but actively inaccessible to most people, because the secondary meaning has colonized the very word. When people hear the word Sodom today, the economic reading, the one Ezekiel clearly articulated, the one the rabbis debated in the Talmud, the one most consistent with the prophetic tradition's consistent emphasis on economic justice, is simply not available. The word has been sealed, and something else has been sealed with it. A question, a very uncomfortable question that the prophets kept asking, and that the substituted reading permanently closes. Here is where I want to leave you. Ezekiel's indictment of Sodom is one of the most precise and specific moral diagnoses in the entire Hebrew Bible. Pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness, and the failure to strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. Read those words again, not as an ancient description of a destroyed city, as a description of a kind of society, a society that has more than enough, that takes pride in what it has accumulated, that has the luxury of idleness, of not needing to struggle, of having systems that maintain the abundance without requiring effort from those who benefit from it. And that has constructed, around all of that, a culture of looking away from those who have nothing. Does that description apply to any society you can think of? Any culture that currently exists? Any economic arrangement that is currently defended, celebrated, and maintained by people who have the luxury of not thinking about who it excludes? The prophets of Israel were not subtle about this. They returned to it again and again, in book after book, in image after image. The widows and the orphans, the poor at the gate, the wages withheld, the scales falsified, the wealthy at ease in Zion, while the poor are crushed. This was the sin that the prophetic tradition identified as the defining failure of civilization. Not private sexual conduct, economic injustice. The organized, systematic, culturally normalized failure to share. And the story of Sodom, in its original prophetic interpretation, was the most dramatic illustration of what happens to a society that makes this failure its defining characteristic. A society so organized around the protection of its own abundance that it has passed laws against helping strangers. So proud of what it has that it cannot see what it owes. So full of bread that the hunger of others has become invisible. That story was replaced. The replacement was convenient. It is much easier to condemn a sexual act performed by people who are different from you than to confront an economic arrangement that you participate in and benefit from. The sexual reading of Sodom asks nothing of the reader except to disapprove of someone else's conduct. The economic reading asks everything. It asks whether your own society, your own culture, your own way of organizing wealth and power and comfort resembles the city that the prophet said deserved to be destroyed? Very few people want to ask that question, which may be exactly why the story was changed, to make it impossible to ask. The hand of the poor and needy was reaching out. Sodom did not strengthen it. 2,000 years later, a substitution was made that ensured most people would never even know that was what the story was about. Think about what that substitution has cost, and who it has cost it to. If you want to go deeper on the prophetic tradition's economic theology, the rabbinic interpretations of Sodom in the Talmud, and the documentary history of the sexual reading's development in early Christian theology, everything is linked in the description. Subscribe if you